Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, let's make a start. So this week we're talking about internal governance, and basically by internal governance we mean management. But we mean management by more than just the executive. So what I want you to get out of your reading and today's session is an understanding of internal oversight mechanisms, and we'll only cover those quite briefly in the course. You need to read about them. The purpose and structure of boards of directors, we'll talk a fair bit about the purpose. The structure is fairly straightforward. But, the roles and nature of board committees, we'll talk about them in general form, not each and every type of committee. But you'll be able to read about different types of committees at some depth, and I'll tell you the ones I think you should emphasise. And we're going to have some discussion around the roles of directors and managers. We'll be focusing on what's called unitary boards. That'll be clear in a moment if you're not already familiar with it. And then we're going to talk very briefly about differences in director and executive remuneration, but we're only going to talk about it very briefly. And you'll discuss that also next week in workshops, but it'll only be in principle because you'll do that as a separate topic in week. I think I say on the slide week 7, I think you do it in week 8. So this is where we're about to go. So it's kind of repeating what the objectives were a bit. So this is just a plan for the following discussion. So let's just start off about getting clear what we mean by unitary boards versus two-tier boards. They're the two main kinds of board structures we see around the world. I'm not aware of a third. So in all corporations we have executive management, and in the unitary board we have, sitting at that apex of management control, the board of directors. And that board of directors may have some overlap with the executive. There might be 0 executives on it. There may be a majority of the directors are executives, although that is rare. But having at least one is fairly common, and that's usually the chief executive, quite often sits on the board. Sometimes the chief financial officer, and I'll explain who that person is a bit later, may sit on the board. Occasionally there's a third executive. But in some, say, US corporations, there's actually a whole bunch of vice presidents and things sitting around that also have board membership. And we can get to a position where a majority of the board is executive directors, although that is fairly rare these days. It used to be more common. So the other directors are non-executive directors, and those non-executive directors are external to the corporation. That is, they usually do not have any other paid position within the corporation. And we'll talk about them in a little bit more depth later as well. Compare that to the two-tier board. At the top of its executive management pyramid is a management committee. It can have all sorts of names, but I'm calling it a management committee. Sometimes it's called a board of directors, sometimes it's called an executive board. It's heaps of names it can have. But it is a board made up entirely of executive management. It doesn't contain any external directors. And above that sits a supervisory board. And in the ideal arrangement, that supervisory board should be made up solely of external directors, and ideally what we call independent directors. Not all external directors are independent, and hopefully that'll be clearer by the end of today as well. It is also common enough to be worth mentioning that in a lot of systems that use two-tier boards, that there might be an employee representative sitting on the management board. So that, for example, is a feature of the German structure. But it's highly variable, and in some systems, individual corporations may choose to have labour representation on its management board, even though it's not necessarily obliged to. In the German system, they're obliged to, at least for a particular class of corporation. So most countries of the world have either of those systems. They are either a unitary or a single-tier board structure, or they're the two-tier structure. And quite common in jurisdictions have a two-tier structure. We'll often say they have a multi-stakeholder view of governance, whereas the single-tier structure, the unitary board, is more often focused on the agency concerns of governance, that is the relationships and potential conflicts between investors and management. That's an historical position and not necessarily where we're at now. Both systems have evolved a lot. Very occasionally you find a country that has both systems available. So historically France has allowed corporations to choose which structure they will have. That structure is then fixed in the constitution of the company. But the vast majority of countries by law mandate one of those two systems, right? Not both. As time goes on, you'll see that we will have some different concerns, potential governance concerns attaching to each of these structures. Each of them convey some advantages and disadvantages. So in those charts I showed you, there was the apex with the board of directors sitting at the top. You open up most organisational management textbooks and all they'll have is the pyramid with the chief executive sitting at the top. Quite typically in management books they don't mention the board of directors in anything other than some cursory reference. They don't include them as part of the organisational charts usually, although some have evolved in recent years. The question is, why when we look at those classical organisational charts does the board of directors not appear? Well, when we talk about the roles of the board versus the roles of management in a moment, the roles of the executive in a moment, that should become, I hope, a little bit clearer as to why that might be the case. But at this point we'll just note the main reason is because the board of directors is not normally engaged in the day-to-day management of the corporation. It does not have operational responsibilities, or not direct ones. It is largely there for guidance and oversight. And so the guidance and oversight includes strategic direction. But while it doesn't have direct responsibilities for operational decisions, it is legally ultimately responsible for all decisions, including operational, because it's the overseer and the director of the executive management. That hopefully will also become clearer as we progress. So if I want it to be part of the management structure, then I've got to answer, what does it manage? And the slightly glib or simplistic answer is that the board of directors manages the management. It manages the executive. But it also manages a lot of external relations. So it has primary responsibility for the corporation discharging its accountability functions. So it reports to shareholders, and it guides and manages that reporting process, the disclosure process. So it manages executive management and it manages relations with external shareholders. The second one is not an exclusive domain. They may often delegate a lot of external engagement functions to executives, but it's still the board's province. But overall, anything to do with executive management functions, which means operational decisions, is the province of the CEO. This, of course, is a generalisation, and like all generalisations, there's lots of exceptions. So we can find plenty of corporations where the CEO carries a lot of the burden for strategic planning, even though notionally we'd say that's the role of the board. And we will see some corporations, often where there's a dominant shareholder, where directors seem to interfere a lot more. The chair of the board might interfere a lot more with operational decisions, even though they don't necessarily carry an executive office. So the trouble with talking like this is we are talking generalisations, and lots of individual companies have their own way of doing things that may differ a little. But what remains true is that at law, the board sits at the top and is responsible for the actions of the corporation and for its disclosures and engagement with external parties. They can't say that was a management function, because the answer will always be, the legal response will always be, you're responsible for what management does. The board is the mind of the corporation. And that's going to matter a lot later when we start talking about corporate ethics and the like. And what we're not going to talk much about in this course is the legal arena affecting boards and legal liability. But thought about it raising last week, but it kind of fits better when we want to talk about officers of the corporation, directors and executives, is the legal position of the corporation and wrongdoing. And this ties in with how legislation, legal arrangements for corporations work, and the attitudes of courts, and it's a complex problem, and we're just going to mention it and leave it, but we're not going to solve it. Okay, so the problem is, can corporations commit crimes? Because a corporation, remember, is an artificial device. It's a legal person created by a legal process. It's not, there's nothing natural about it. A corporation as an entity, as a device, can't speak, can't think, can't act. Right? Everything a corporation does is really done by people. The decision maker, the mind of the corporation, the party that decides what's in the interests of the corporation, is the board of directors. That's a fairly unambiguous position in all jurisdictions. I'm not aware of any exceptions. But lots of people in executive management make lots of decisions on behalf of the corporation. So a group of people are empowered to create a corporation because it has particular objectives. You are not permitted to create a corporation for illegal purposes. No jurisdiction allows this. You can only create a corporation to do things that corporations are allowed to do. So if you are the mind of the corporation and you are acting in the interests of the corporation, how can you cause a corporation to commit a crime? So my position on this, my proposition on this, is that crimes can only be committed by the people making the decisions. So the people making the decisions are the ones that should be subject to prosecution and penalty, not the corporation. The corporation is just a legal artifice, a device. It doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't have a concept of right and wrong. It doesn't even think or make decisions. The board is the mind of the corporation, does all that. So the reason I present this proposition here is to focus on this idea that the directors are the mind of the corporation, and it's the directives in executive management that determine all corporate action. The corporation as an artificial person doesn't do anything except exist as a legal construct. So all actions are human actions. I will find you no shortage of directors and executives that would disagree with that proposition, who don't like that proposition, and maybe a few academics as well. So what I've given you is an opinion. It's an informed opinion, and it's a reasoned one, but it's an opinion, and not everyone agrees with it. But it's something for you to contemplate, because in thinking about it, even if you choose not to agree with it, in thinking about it, you have to think about what's the real role of the board and executive management and what their relationship with the corporation is. So this is a fairly famous quote about the role of the board, and it's written by a UK inquiry, a commission of inquiry that was chaired by a person called Adrian Cadbury. And so this is quite a famous report in the history of corporate governance. It's not just applied in the UK. It's been examined and used around the world, just as has another important corporate governance report, the King Report out of South Africa, is being used internationally. Because they were carefully considered inquiries into the nature of corporations and regulation of them. So this was leading to a reform of UK corporate law. That's what it drove in the end. But the Cadbury report defined the unitary board as having the role of setting strategic aims, providing leadership to put them into effect, supervising the management, and reporting to shareholders on their stewardship. I'd say, while I'm not in a position to disagree with that, I would say a few things have changed since 1992. And the thing that's changed most is this view that represents what we call the shareholder supremacy principle or concept. And so we're not accountable. Most corporations in most jurisdictions now see their accountability as much broader than just to shareholders. In the US, there's a whole bunch of states that have changed their corporations law, where it now says directors should pay attention to stakeholders other than shareholders in their decision making, and that includes then their accountability functions. And in lots of jurisdictions, governments have regulated to require corporations to report more broadly and to report on more matters than just the traditionally reported financial issues that were being considered back in the 1990s when Cadbury, or the 1980s really, when Cadbury was running this commission. We also note that some boards variously delegate some of these tasks, such as some of the reporting or some of the work behind the reporting function, and in how much leadership is provided. There's a lot of corporations rely more now on the chief executive than they used to. The UK model before was much more that the public spokesperson for a corporation was the chair of the board, and the public rarely heard from the chief executive. That was quite different to the US model, where the public frequently heard from the chief executive, but the chief executive then was also quite often the chair of the board. So it was kind of ambiguous as to why they got to be the spokesperson. And the Australian circumstance used to be more like the UK one, but we see that's evolved quite a bit over the last 25 years. And we see now chief executives often more taking a public profile role for corporations and speaking on their behalf rather than the chair of the board. And we usually only hear from the chair of the board when something's gone wrong with respect to the chief executive, such as they're about to remove them. And so you'll see an example of that when you do your case study number 1, AMP, because you'll see one of the things that happened with AMP was the removal of the chief executive. Actually replaced the board, replaced the chair as well. And then you see for the interim period, while they're trying to get the board sorted out, management functions, some of the management functions fixed, or trying, the emphasis on trying to. When you do your case study, you'll realise AMP hasn't succeeded in some of its attempts. Then we find the chair of the board was doing a lot of the public speaking, not the chief executive. So, but you'll often see in the financial press now the quotes being quotes from the chief executive or interviews with the chief executive, not the chair of the board. So there's been some change in the way this works. And so that suggests now that there's a lot more leadership coming from the chief executive than from the board itself. Now, that's what's happening. That's not necessarily what should happen. So I'm not describing what is the best position in this regard. Should this be led by the chair of the board or should be led by the chief executive? Don't have an answer for, but we've certainly seen a change, but we can't say whether that change is better or worse at this point. We're not going to spend any time on this. This is just another way of looking at the role of the board, so you can think about forward and backward looking roles of the board. So it's forward and backward, and it's inward and it's outward. So the inward looking roles are about management. So So in a forward looking context, the board makes policy for the corporation. And then is responsible for appointing and monitoring and supervising the board in the applications of those policies. So they effectively police or enforce the policies they create. Well, that's their responsibility. Whether or not they do it is an empirical question. In the outward-looking role, they formulate corporate strategy about engagement with the markets, engagement with other stakeholders and the like, and they're responsible for providing accountability, be it to investors or other stakeholders. That's a responsibility, not necessarily a task that they directly do themselves. And we'll talk about the nature of control systems and reporting systems a little later, and you'll visit that again in weeks 9 and 10. All right. So I mentioned earlier we have executive and non-executive directors sitting around boards. So executive directors are people who are employed as executive managers in the corporation and are also, as a consequence of a board decision, an officer of the board, a member of the board of directors. So they are both executives and directors. And then we have people who come from outside the corporation and who are just directors. And so we've seen in some court cases this battled out about, does this change their responsibilities, their roles? Are really the external directors more just about monitoring the executive ones, and it's the executive directors that are kind of responsible for everything because they make operational decisions as executives and the like? And the answer is, directors are directors. The directors, as a board, as a collective, are the mind of the corporation. So we can't say part of our brain is responsible for something that we do, and part of our brain is not responsible. That may be what happens to some of us mentally, but that won't be the position any outside party takes. When someone looks at you, what you do is a consequence of your choices, your decisions, your mind as a single entity. And so the same is true for the corporation. The directors, as the mind of the corporation, are singular. So all components of that mind, all directors, are equally responsible for the actions of the corporation, to the extent that anyone is. So if one director is responsible for a corporate decision, all directors are responsible for a corporate decision, if they're held responsible as a consequence of being on the board. An executive, of course, is a different position. So executives may have all sorts of responsibilities that a director does not. But that doesn't mean as directors they have different responsibilities. That simply means they have two different jobs. Right? They have a job as a director and they have a job as an executive. And as a director, their rights and duties and responsibilities are the same as every other director. It just gets a bit confusing when that role is the oversight of the executive, because then they're helping oversee themselves. And that's why I've got at the bottom here, it gets a bit confusing for some of the directors. because it's when you're looking at a person sitting at a board table, you don't forget that they're the chief financial officer or the chief executive officer, and as a member of the board, you'll ask them all sorts of questions that you don't ask other directors or discuss with other directors. You'll expect them to know things and contribute things that other people can't contribute because they have direct knowledge or direct responsibility for executive functions. So in board discussions, people may have different roles, but from the outside world, they're one thing. Some of that will be fairly obvious to some of you, and for some of you that's going to take a little bit of pondering to get clear how that works. So I said one of the challenges in that is in relation to board oversight. So board oversight is oversight of all corporate activity. But most particularly of interest to us today is their oversight of executive management. And so in that case, we want to say, well, what does oversight actually mean in this context? Well, first of all, let's get clear, something they haven't put up there yet is the board appointed the chief executive. No one else can appoint the chief executive. The board appointed the chief executive. The chief executive then is responsible for appointing everybody below them, although in some of the senior positions, the board may take oversight of that role as well. So the chief executive might have their preferences as to who would be the chief financial officer, but the board may well decide who will be the chief financial officer or the chief operating officer. Or there's a whole bunch of chief officers of different kinds that we can nominate. But they all sit below the chief executive. They will all report to the chief executive. Of course, a board will not appoint someone to that role that the chief executive indicates he or she can't work with. So it's always, even if the board is taking a major role in the appointment of senior executives, it'll always be, in the end, in agreement with the chief executive. But in the majority of corporations, it's really the chief executive that makes the recommendations to the board in that regard, or at least in my observation. So with that in mind, we can now understand how then the board has this quite strong supervisory role. Has this strong supervisory role. In relation to executives. It's because they're effectively the boss. Okay. So the board sets strategic direction and policies. The board is responsible for the appointment of executives who are going to implement the directions and policies. And then so they're going to evaluate the executive's performance in that regard. So when we say the board monitors, we don't mean they just watch, right? They do something about it. So they monitor and evaluate performance. When the board appointed executives, they also, at least notionally, took responsibility for the contract with that executive, which includes their performance and remuneration arrangements. And we'll come back to that a little bit in a small amount at the end of today's session. But, when we talk very briefly about some principles involving remuneration. We also say the board has oversight for accountability. So let's just think of that in the simplest terms at the moment. Let's say the financial reporting obligations of accountability. So all corporations must provide all shareholders with financial statements every year. In some jurisdictions, it's a lot more than every year. It might be 6 monthly or quarterly. But in every jurisdiction, it's at least once a year. And the corporations law of that country says that the board must do this, that the board is responsible. It says the corporation must do it in every jurisdiction, and in most jurisdictions it says the board is responsible for that. But of course, the board's just a bunch of people that only meets every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks or however often they meet. They might meet for a whole day, but it's still only that sort of periodic function. They don't sit there preparing financial statements. The financial statements of a corporation are prepared by the accounting division. There's a whole department of people, of accountants with systems that produce the financial reports. They produce lots of financial reports, but it includes the ones that go to the shareholders. That accounting system is overseen by the executive management. The accounting functions are typically overseen by the chief financial officer. So they might have different names in different companies. We used to call them the chief accountant. But these days, CFO is the most common term around the world. Their functions might often include more than the accounting functions. They might be responsible for risk management and other planning issues. But it includes the accounting system of the company and the production of financial reports. But the chief financial officer reports to the chief executive. So the financial reports for which the board is responsible are prepared under the general management of the chief financial officer and the chief executive officer. So the board, in supervising how this works, is still dependent on the executive. The board doesn't directly supervise the accounting functions. So responsibility for something, you can see, carries a lot more burden because you're going to be responsible for things that are really being done by other parties, and which is rather difficult for you to influence. And we're going to come back to that a little when we talk about committees and we talk about the audit committee, because the audit committee has a particularly important role in this regard now. That's only something of the last decade. The quality of financial reports, production of those financial reports, is highly dependent on the corporation's internal control systems. So the quality of information is very dependent on internal control systems. And those internal control systems, of course, are influenced by everybody that participates in that system. So we can design controls, but how well they work depends on the people involved and the way the system is constructed. And so now we're saying, well, the board's also responsible for that. Just as a point of some slight change that's taken place in that regard in the last, well, we can date it pretty specifically, since about 2003. So in 2003, we had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the US, and this has influenced some other jurisdictions. In Australia, we had the Clerk-9 Act at the same time. And they did some similar things, but they did them a little bit differently. In the US, there's Section 404 and 504 certifications that must be prepared by the chief executive and the chief financial officers. One of those certifications, both of those executives say that they have taken all necessary steps to ensure that the financial statements are true and correct. In the other certification, the 404 certification, they say they have taken all necessary steps to ensure that the system of internal controls for the system that produces those financial reports they've also taken steps to ensure that they are reliable. Now, that's a big burden to sign on to say that you've taken all necessary steps to make sure the system works properly. And those statements are lodged with the SEC as matters of public record. So we have these certifications signed by two executives, the chief executive officer and the chief financial officer, that tells the public that they, as individuals, are taking responsibility for the financial statements and the internal control system. This is federal legislation that requires this. All the state legislation under which the corporations are constituted make it clear that it's the board of directors that's responsible for the financial statements sent to shareholders. So we have a little bit of a conflict there. The reason that the national government, that Congress brought in this legislation, was because of so many concerns about the low quality of financial statements. So you've got to think about the corporate scandals that led to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So we can refer to things like Enron and WorldCom, but there was a whole bunch of them. There was DuPont and Sunbeam, and there was a whole decade of corporate scandals. It's just that Enron was the biggest of them all, and that's what eventually forced political action. And all of these involved fraudulent financial statements that were wrong, and people had deliberately made them misleading. And so the typical executive response when they would be sued for this, so it's the shareholders that sue. The shareholders would sue the board, and they'd sue the executive officers, and they'd sue the corporation as an entity. Right? And the typical defence of the board was, well, we rely on the executive to do this. This is a big corporation. We can't know everything that's going on in there. Yes, we are aware of the board and we take responsibility for corporate actions, but these were really operational things that we can't oversee. We're not involved in directly, and we only know what the executive tells us. So if the executive gives us fraudulent statements, then we don't know any different. And then the chief executive officer would turn around and argue pretty much the same thing. That's a big corporation. They're not involved in all these minute operational decisions. This is done by the accounting department. We can't expect us to know what's going on into their day-to-day decision-making and activities. And so they did not. And so these defences would work somewhat in these civil cases. And so that's the reason the SEC, not the SEC, this is the reason the Congress brought in this legislation, was to say, well, people are not going to have any confidence in these financial statements with these sorts of arguments. So the only way we can restore confidence is if we make these executives responsible. But in doing so, they've actually created potentially a different legal liability regime. Because now it'll be even easier for the board of directors, perhaps, to argue that they can't really be held responsible, because after all, look, the chief executive and the CFO signed off on these things and took responsibility for them. So it really wasn't for us to be challenging them or arguing about those. Now, I haven't seen any court cases where that's emerged, and it's been 15 years, so you think something would have happened by now. But it's still, at least on a paper analysis, is a potential or is a concern for potentially conflicting legislation in the US. In the Australian context, they took a different approach. They do require the CEO and the CFO to take responsibility for internal controls and financial statements, but not publicly. In the Australian legislation that went through is what we call CLERP 9. And CLERP stands for the Commercial Law Economic Reform Program, and 9 tells you there had been 9 stages, but it was the only stage concerned with accountability. In that program, they require the certification to be between the executive and the board. And so the board has to say in their report that they've received the appropriate certifications from the executive. So the line of authority stays through the board of directors. So in doing so, the Australian Parliament was trying to avoid the potential conflict by saying you've got the board responsible for everything and then the executive also responsible for the same thing in parallel. They were trying to make it that clearly that the executive sits below the board, and that the line of authority and responsibility still goes through the board of directors. And so that's an interesting different approach in the different jurisdictions. And it might tell us something about the way they see the nature of corporations and their boards in those different jurisdictions. It might also just mean there was some confusion that nobody noticed at the time. Delegation is a tricky thing. Right? We can delegate lots of things, but delegating does not absolve you of responsibility. So you can imagine yourself in a workplace where you're responsible for some work function and you delegate it to an assistant, and that assistant does it. If the assistant gets it wrong, then as far as your supervisor is concerned, it's still your fault. You're responsible. Saying I delegated it won't be seen as a defence. So the general axiom, the general principle you usually put out is you can delegate authority, you can't delegate responsibility. And so when boards delegate roles to the chief executive, that does not absolve the board of responsibility for how those roles are discharged. So if a board says we want the chief executive to drive the strategic planning process, that doesn't mean the board can turn around and say to the shareholders, oh, it's not our fault, we've got a bad strategy, we left that to the chief executive. The board will still be responsible. So delegation does not absolve you of oversight responsibilities. Just come back to the accountability and control functions, just briefly, just another complication that we want to note there is that the board, in discharging its supervision or oversight responsibilities, is in an invidious position because it is largely dependent on information provided to it by the executive. Just as shareholders only get corporate information from the corporation via the board only gets operational information through the executive. There is no way of observing it directly or engaging, unless you're an executive director, but that's just highlighting the problem of unitary boards, that some directors can directly engage and observe and other directors can't. And so this contributes a lot to the complexity of the relationships between executives and directors. So here's a couple of questions we're just going to comment briefly on now about how you go, what you might like to think about in answering them, but you're going to answer them for yourself next week, because this is part of your preparation for next week's workshop. So I haven't talked about independent directors at this point. I've only talked about executive directors and non-executive directors. A non-executive director is a director external to the corporation. They don't have any executive functions in the corporation. But when I said that, I noted that they may or may not be independent. First, we have to see, what the heck do we mean by independent? Independent of what? Well, the idea is, first, they're independent of executive activity, executive roles. So if you're going to oversee the executive, you can't be one of the executive. So when we want the board to oversee executive management, it's a problem when we have executive directors. An executive director can't oversee themselves. And so, although we say the board as a single board is responsible for its functions, we know that objectively the oversight burden falls on the non-executive directors, at least in terms of overseeing the performance of executives. But not all non-executive directors are independent of corporate activity. So there's some things they can't effectively oversee. So a typical example is a related party transaction. So a director of one corporation may be a director of another corporation. And that other corporation and this corporation might be transacting in some important way. So we're concerned that the transaction's material, right, that it has real economic substance. We're not talking about buying office stationery or something. Although a famous example in Australia was about buying transport. So this particular example applied to the, I'm going to misremember it was the Coles group, okay? So Coles Supermarkets, the corporation that owns the Coles Supermarkets, had on its board a person called Lindsay Fox. One of the major transport companies in Australia is Fox Transport, which Lindsay Fox created. He was the founder of it, built his own empire. He started off with one person driving one truck, himself, and he grew it into the largest trucking company in Australia. And that company kept winning the contracts for transport for the Coles supermarkets. And so a lot of external shareholders got very concerned that Lindsay Fox was having too much influence in this decision about who gets this contract, because it was his corporation. He was a controlling shareholder in his corporation. It was his corporation that kept getting the deals. Now, the problem we have there then is that Lindsay Fox was a non-executive director, but we can certainly see that in some of the decisions of the corporation, he was not financially independent. He stood to personally benefit from this decision making. So an independent director is someone who's not in that position. Another curious example we can look at is Coca-Cola Amatil. So in Australia, Coca-Cola Amatil is a public corporation that holds the Australian and some of the Asian Pacific licensing for the Coca-Cola Corporation. So the Coca-Cola Corporation is an American corporation. It's the corporation that owns all the intellectual property. It owns all the patents and copyrights attaching to the brand names and recipes and merchandising of the Coca-Cola Corporation. But Coca-Cola Amatil has an exclusive contract where they're the sole licensed producers and sellers of Coca-Cola corporations in the region. They are not a subsidiary of the Coca-Cola Corporation. But the Coca-Cola Corporation does own, I think it's 29% of the shares. 29% of the shares is really enough to do what you like. You could win every shareholder vote with that. In most Australian corporations, you can win just about every shareholder vote with just 15% of the shares, because the rest of the ownership is so small, so thin, so scattered, that they can't organise to vote against you. So you notice you don't, in corporations in countries like Australia and the US, where we tend not to have controlling shareholders, majority shareholders, you can have quite a fairly modest shareholding and still have control. And 30% is typically seen as the number that's enough. Okay. But the Coca-Cola Corporation does not exercise that control. They actually have a very specific agreement with Coca-Cola Amatil that they will not do so. They appoint they appoint two directors. We call them nominee directors because they're the nominees of the Coca-Cola Corporation. The other, I've forgotten the size of the board now, 5 or 6 directors. Well, sorry, one of them is a chief executive, so no one appoints them. They're there because of the chief executive. The others are all voted for by the other shareholders. Coca-Cola chooses not to engage in that vote. They agreed that they won't vote their shares when it comes to choosing directors. They just choose their 2 and that's it. Now that's an unusual position. Okay. And there's plenty of cases where that's not how it works, that someone with 30% of the shares will choose all the directors. But the point of this exercise is those 2 nominee directors are not independent directors. They're not independent for 2 reasons. One, they are chosen by a party that has a specific commercial relationship with the company in question. If it was just another shareholder who happened to own that many shares, we might see it differently. But because there is such an important trading relationship between the Coca-Cola Corporation and Coca-Cola Amatil, then they're not independent of the financial transactions of the corporation. The other reason is because they are there specifically to represent the Coca-Cola Corporation. And if you're there to represent any agency, then you're not independent. You represent the interests of that agency. So therefore, they're not really representing the interests of the full body of shareholders. So At law, according to Australian law, they are. According to the Australian law, all directors are responsible to all shareholders. Well, they're all equally responsible to the corporation, and the corporation has to be managed in that interest. But in practice, that's not what happens in this corporation. If they ever got sued, law would override their practice. But we know in terms of how the company's actually operating, we know what it's doing. Just as a curiosity, just so you understand a little bit more about that case, it's not important to today's topic, that Coca-Cola Amatil also has a special board committee, the Related Party Committee. Most corporations don't have this committee. But the Related Party Committee's job is to oversee all transactions with related parties. And of course, the major related party is the Coca-Cola Corporation. It's related through shareholdings and through transactions. So they're regarded as related party transactions, and also because it has two nominee directors, so that also makes it a related party. And so that committee is made up of independent directors. It excludes the executive and it excludes the nominee directors. So they've taken a lot of safeguards to sort of protect the interests of other investors and participants in Coca-Cola Amatil. But what it does is help us look at some of the issues surrounding this concept of independent directors. That's why it was raised. So we can see independence is independence of all sorts of things. It's not a simple rule as to what makes you independent. So the vast majority of shareholders own shares in the corporation. Now, in that sense, they're not independent of shareholders because they are shareholders. We usually regard this as a good thing. Right? That's seen as a positive aspect. So they are seen as independent directors in terms of their oversight of management, and they're seen as being better aligned with shareholders, which historically has been seen as a preferred position. Because remember, we originally had the shareholder supremacy principle driving our attitude towards governance, where we wanted the corporation to be managed with shareholder interests in mind, and not anything else. And directors with shareholdings are more likely to do that more effectively because it helps align their interests with the shareholders' interests. You can think about that for yourself as whether that's now a good thing or a bad thing if you're trying to take a multi-stakeholder view. But what I haven't answered, and what you're going to have to answer next week, is why do we want independent directors? Not what they are, but why do we want them? And so we've already talked a bit about today about some of that aspect, about the relationship between the board collectively and executive managers. But you're going to have to think about that some more and try and talk about it in a more complicated role. And think about things about, they're not just overseers. Remember, they appointed the board and they're asking the board to do a particular job. You can't just be an overseer of that. You've got to engage in more positive roles, more positive ways. So the relationship is more complex than what's been portrayed so far. Okay, we'll just take a 10-minute break and then carry on. Right, we might get restarted. It's been 10 minutes, hasn't it? So we're talking about directors as being the ultimate controllers of the corporation, as in they make all the real decisions. Right? The question is, who controls the controllers? So we'd like to think, well, a lot of people would like to think shareholders do. Say, after all, shareholders vote for directors. Why don't you think about how does a shareholder vote for a director? You go to the annual general meeting, or you get the papers for the annual general meeting, and there will be the slate of directors for you to vote for. Who prepared that slate of directors? Who decided who would be the directors? The directors decided. When there's a vacancy, or when they choose to make the board bigger, the directors engage in the search for a replacement, for an additional director or a replacement director. And they recommend the name to the shareholders, and the shareholders vote for or against. It is very, very rare that shareholders get a list of competing directors. That is, if there's 3 vacancies, you usually get 3 names to vote for. You don't get 4 or 5 or 6 names and choose which ones you want. There's no real democratic process in this. Right? Now, in theory, there could be, but that's not how it works. Because someone's got to decide how names get onto the ballot. It can't just be like a free-for-all where all the shareholders can suggest all the different directors, because otherwise you'd wind up with ballots of thousands of people, most of whom would just be the shareholders wanting themselves to be directors. So it's a controlled process, and it's controlled by the board. So the board effectively appoints the board and perpetuates it. Where that's different is when there's a controlling shareholder. A controlling shareholder can be a majority shareholder, then they have absolute control. That means if you've got more than 50% of the shares, you have total control of the corporation, and no one can interfere with that. Because it wouldn't matter, even if every other shareholder coordinated and voted against you, you'd still win. So you can appoint all the directors. That's typically the case in family-dominated corporations, which are most of the corporations in the world. It's not most of the corporations in the US, and it's only a small number of corporations in Australia. And it's only a smallish number, a few more in the UK compared to Australia, but it's still only a small number. But across Europe and across Asia, they're mostly family-dominated companies. Same's true in South America as far as I know. And South Africa is kind of more like Australia in that regard. There's a few family-dominated companies, but most are not. But we're not just talking about family-dominated companies. There can be any controlling shareholder. It might be a government. Quite often it's another corporation, and then we need to know who controls that corporation. So one of the famous ones, let's say News Corp. So News Corp is a Delaware corporation. News Corp owns the Wall Street Journal, the London Times, the Australian, and sort of the list goes on. It's the biggest press empire in the world. It also owns TV channels, so it owns, well, did own, sold a lot of it recently, but owned Fox and other major film production houses and other media interests. In the States, it owns a bunch of radio stations as well. It's controlled, unambiguously controlled, by the Murdoch family. So the Murdochs collectively own less than 30% of the voting shares, but that's enough. But there are 2 classes of shares in News Corp. There are voting shares and non-voting shares, and there are equal numbers of each. And all the shares that the Murdochs own are voting shares. They don't own any non-voting shares. The shares sell for slightly different prices on the stock market, but not hugely different. The non-voting shares are worth a tiny bit less, a little bit less. So in terms of the contributed capital, the Murdoch only own less than 15%. In terms of voting shares, they own nearly 30%. And with that, that's enough to control the corporation. So the Murdoch sons hold, and the daughter these days, hold senior executive positions in the corporation. They run some of the subsidiaries and some of the international operations. Rupert Murdoch is still chair of the board. And he's the one that grew the empire. When he inherited it from his father, it basically only owned the Advertiser, which is an Adelaide news company. So News Corp used to be an Australian corporation, migrated. Now corporations, of course, can't migrate. They are products of a jurisdiction. So there was a News Corporation, it was the Australian corporation, and they created a new corporation in the US that acquired everything that News Corporation owned around the world to create a US corporation. And because of the media interest, the Murdochs also had to take out US citizenship to satisfy media ownership laws in the US. So everything moved to the States. And so Rupert Murdoch grew all this and has ruled over it as an individual for the last 40 odd years. So the market discipline over the Murdochs is trivial. And it's trivial because half the shares don't vote, so shareholders don't get to do much. And also the Murdochs don't really care whether the price goes up and down because they're not selling their shares. For a long time, News Corporation didn't pay dividends. I'm not sure if it's paying them now, but for a long time it didn't pay any dividends. And when people complain about not paying dividends, the Murdoch response was, well, if you don't like it, sell your shares. And that was the whole attitude. Right? So there was very little real accountability to shareholders, to investors. So the discipline area is controlled. So who controlled the controllers? Well, the controllers, as the board in that case, were controlled by Rupert Murdoch. He decided who every director would be. Now, that's since changed a bit, because now other Murdochs get a say in it. But it hasn't changed much. Now, we can find lots of corporations around the world like this. Lots of corporations where there's a dominant shareholder and they decide who is the board, and the disciplining function then is a consequence, it's in the hands of that shareholder. They control the controllers. The idea of market discipline is that the market, now I haven't said which market yet, but somehow the market will punish the directors if they're not doing a good job. Well, the first market you might think of is the stock market. So you punish the directors, how? By reducing the share price, right? So people don't like what's happening, they develop negative views about the corporation, then a lot of them want to sell their shares, and to get people to buy them, the price has to go down. So the price should fall if people are concerned about the quality of board oversight. Question, how much does the board care about that? The answer might be, depends on how many shares they own, would be a starting point. The more shares they own, the more they might care. That's why I said earlier, we often think of directors owning shareholders as a good thing, because that means they're going to be more sensitive to that market discipline, that market reaction. But that's only true if you plan on selling your shares, and if those shares are actually important to you. So we can look at it and say, oh great, that director owns $100,000 worth of shares in the company they're a director of. That should make them pay attention. And so, well, if the director's wealth is $50 million, they're not going to care about 100,000 shares. So while numbers can look impressive and dramatic in that regard, they don't necessarily create that level of exposure because it depends on how important it is to that person's wealth. So the share market in this regard is not a great vehicle for punishing directors, because how much is a director punished when a share price goes down? If you didn't plan on selling your shares, you're really not being punished at all in any financial sense. But it can punish you in terms of reputation. So if companies in which you're a director are being punished by the market, by the stock market, then that might lead to you being punished in your personal professional market. That is, if you're a professional director, then your future well-being depends on your reputation as a director. So if I get really negative views about my work as a director of one corporation, other corporations aren't going to want me as a director. So I'm limiting my future opportunities. So we can see the directors' labour market punishing directors through reputation effects and therefore future employment opportunity effects. Now, how much that is, how much that works, how good an effect that is, might depend quite a bit on the individual director as to what actually their interests are. If they're actually chief executive of another corporation, that's really their main focus and concern. They might not much care about what happens to them in the directors' labour market if that's not where they see their future. If they're reaching their end of their careers, they're thinking about retiring, that's not going to interest them. So how well this sort of market disciplining effect works also depends on the personal circumstances of the directors concerned. So it's not a guaranteed thing that we can rely on to try and get directors to do the best job possible. So then we come back to regulators. So what can regulators do about directors doing bad jobs? Well, it depends on the nature of the bad job. If it's just bad business decisions or lazy management, not doing your job very well and just not working hard enough, there's nothing a regulator can do. The regulator can only step in if you've breached the regulations. So if you've actually been negligent in your job to the point where people are doing bad things and you didn't do anything, like criminal things, and you didn't do anything about it, then sure, the regulator can then punish you because you've failed to discharge your responsibilities as a director. But just being not very good at your job doesn't give the regulator anything to work with. So regulators can really only work basically if you're breaking the law or if you're breaching your duties as a director, your legal duties as a director. Then we come to public opinion. Not sure what public opinion does. Some people are impervious to public criticism, some people are sensitive to it. So it comes down to the individual director again as to whether or not that matters. So probably no one's received more public criticism as a chair of a board than, say, Rupert Murdoch. A lot of that's political, but it's not that's very severe public criticism. He doesn't care. And he controls the corporation, and he's the one that grew it to what it is. He sees it as a product of his own vision and planning. And so public opinion doesn't matter to him. It's not like he's seeking political office. He's not looking for you to vote for him. It's not a popularity contest. And other directors would seem to be the same. But some directors are very sensitive to their public profile. And so they may be more reactive to adverse press coverage. If you're getting criticised in the news media or in social media, then maybe that will influence their future behaviour. But that's speculative. We haven't got any really good way of measuring that or seeing if it happens. But public opinion, of course, about directors collectively might lead to regulatory action. If enough of the public get annoyed about some corporate behaviours, perhaps the lawmakers will do something. That is, politicians might do something about it. So that sort of threat might be enough to make some corporations or some boards more sensitive to performance. And so that leads me to the one that's not up there, and that is other directors. So if a board is doing a bad job, then the only thing we can hope for is shareholders doing something about it, like not voting for them next time round. But if individual directors are doing a bad job, the other directors can do something about it. They can agree not to put that person's name. That is, they can agree by vote not to put that person's name on the ballot for the next AGM and effectively then remove them from the board. Now, of course, no one wants to be seen as being sacked in that regard, so usually the discussion is more like, we want you to resign, and the person resigns, and they all have all their own reasons for resigning. A bit like when politicians resign. It's kind of the same thing. They'll have all sorts of reasons, but it's basically because everyone else wanted them out. And so boards can work that way. So boards can be political beasts. Normally that's not what you expect to see from a board, because boards are usually very protective of each other. Because a divisive board, a divided board, is seen as a bad sign. That's dysfunctional. We normally expect boards to be acting in the public domain in a cohesive fashion. You don't expect to see one director fighting with another director. When we do see that, that corporation is usually punished very severely in the marketplace. And then the board has to work out what to do about it, and they usually do it by forcing one of the directors out. So we know boards can discipline individual members through their own internal power. Okay. And that's probably what we rely on the most, unless there are dominant shareholders, controlling shareholders. If there's a controlling shareholder, then that's basically where the power lies. I want to turn attention now briefly to the functioning of the board, because corporations, large corporations, are very complex things. We have some corporations where their scale of wealth and activity is bigger than some small countries. And so directing those sorts of corporations is a very complex task. And there's a lot of things directors are responsible for. So to work more efficiently, boards these days rely a lot on subcommittees. This is something that evolved in the late 20th century. It wasn't always the case. But then corporations got a lot bigger in the late 20th century. And a subcommittee is a subset of the board. They're not other people that are brought in. They are directors. So if I've got a board of, let's say, or the average Australian board, 9 people. Okay, the average Australian board is about 8.5, 9, something like that. So some are quite a bit smaller, some get as big as 13 or 14, but most of them are bunched around the 8 to 10 range. So one of those is the chief executive, let's say, and the rest of them are externals. The majority of them are probably independents. So let's say out of a board of 9 people, take off the chief executive, I've got 8. Maybe one or two. One of those is the chair of the board, so they're pretty busy already. So I'm down to 7. And I think they've got to consider all the accountability and disclosure functions. They've got to deal with strategic planning. They've got to deal with the performance monitoring roles. They've got to worry about risk management. They've got to make sure the corporation is complying with the law. It's a very complicated task, right? And for one director to do that, to cover all those things, is almost a full-time job. Now, most directors aren't directors of one company. Most directors are directors on more than one company. That's how they got to be director of yours, because you looked around for who was doing a good job directing another company and who had good networks and who would be valuable to you, so you brought them in on this corporation. So to operate efficiently, we specialise. So, okay, everyone can't do everything on a full-time basis, so we want 3 of you to worry about corporate governance and compliance, and one another 3 of you to worry about the the audit committee. And you'll break up the tasks on this role. So that's an efficiency device. And so lots of committees do this sort of work all the time. So if you go to the Accounting Standards Board, let's go to the International Accounting Standards Board, because that's a lot bigger. Okay? They're dealing with a lot of complex tasks, plus they've all got real jobs. Okay? Being on the National Accounting Standards Board is just a part-time thing for them. So they can't be covering all the different standards that are under development at any one time. So they break up into working parties. They have subcommittees, and there'll be 7 or 8 of them working on any one project. So all sorts of committees use subcommittees for this purpose, and the board is no different. The idea is the subcommittee that goes off and does its work and comes back and recommends to the rest of the board what the outcome should be with their reasons. Parliament works the same way. Most parliaments use committee structures to achieve the same outcome. They go off and do all the detailed work, come back with a bunch of recommendations. They might then be debated at the board, and the board will make its decision. Bearing in mind that all those members of the subcommittee are members of the board. So what does a risk management committee do? Depends on the corporation. Obviously, it manages risk, but what risks? It depends on what business you're in. So there might be financial risks, there might be compliance risks, there might be really general concepts of business risk. It might be risk in anything. It might be technology risks. It just depends on your business. There's no rules about this. Corporations decide what subcommittees they'll have and what they will do, and it's what works for them. Corporate governance committees, not many corporations have corporate governance committees actually, but some do. Some combine them with compliance, which means complying with corporate law. Some people instead combine the audit committee with the compliance committee. Some people combine corporate governance and CSR. And they might attach all different names to these things. They might call it corporate citizenship. They might call it sustainability committee. It's whatever name they want to create. The audit committee is a special one. Didn't used to be a special one, but now it is. So audit committees came about at the start of the 1990s, really. A few of the larger corporations had them. And they had them not because the board wanted them, but because the auditors asked for them. The auditors were concerned that they couldn't get good enough access to executive management and the directors when they wanted to discuss important issues. Everyone was always too busy to talk to the auditors. So the auditors started to propose to their clients that, look, give us a subcommittee, give us a group of 3 directors or something that we can go and talk to when we've got these issues. And so that these audit committees were being formed. And the audit committee's main job, then it evolved a little bit. So corporations started to say, well, we've got these audit committees. The audit committee should choose the auditor. Save us all sitting around doing all that work. They can go and do the searching and filter the contracts and submissions and nominate who should be the auditor. And it evolved from there. And so by the end of the 90s, most of the top 100 companies had audit committees. And they were doing sort of all sorts of different jobs according to that corporation. But they're always the communication channel between auditors and the corporation. That's how they had evolved. But then things started to change. Regulators started to think audit committees could do more than that. So I don't know of any law that requires a corporation to have an audit committee in any jurisdiction. There might be some in the world, but I don't know them. But places like the US and Australia and the UK and the big Asian markets don't, as a matter of law, require companies to have audit committees. Some of the laws, the way they're written, seem to assume there's an audit committee these days. They don't necessarily require one. But they will talk about things like those charged with governance or those charged with communication with shareholders and those charged with other things as a way of allowing corporations to have different structures. But audit committees these days are subject to all sorts of standards that have been written by different bodies. And typically the audit committee now is responsible for choosing the auditor negotiating the audit contract, which includes the scope of the audit, and has oversight responsibility for the preparation of the financial statements. This was a major evolution of the last, well, really started probably 15 years ago to go that way, or maybe started 20 years ago, but became more noticeable sort of after the Enron type period. And their roles became much more important. These days, a lot of stock exchanges require their big corporations to have audit committees. So stock exchanges are important regulators, and we're going to talk about those in week 5. But they're listing requirements, they're not laws. And so the relationships have changed. And so what happens is the board becomes more reliant on these subcommittees to do these tasks. And so really the people now responsible for a lot of the accountability functions are just going to be 3 independent directors, sometimes 4, but typically 3 independent directors who meet a lot more often than the regular board, particularly in reporting seasons. They have lots of discussions with the auditors. They might even oversee some internal audit function. They might have direct communication with the head of internal audit to have things done. They want controls investigated for themselves. And they then just present the material to the board with their recommendations, and the board kind of accepts it, right? Because they're not going to go back and repeat all the work themselves. And so now we see a much smaller groups of subsets of directors with much more responsibility, not legal responsibility, but personal responsibility in terms of doing the work, sitting on the board. And so we typically see things like the audit committee and the risk management committee as being really high burden tasks. They're much more demanding than some other board responsibilities, just because there's a lot more procedural seasonal work you have to do. And so we see these high levels of reliance. But the work that they produce, even when it goes to the public domain or impacts on corporate performance, all of the directors have responsibility for it. Reliance on the subcommittee does not remove your responsibility as a director. It might make your life easier being able to rely on the subcommittee if you're not a member of it. If you're a member of it, then you'll be compensated. Okay, but the way all of these committees work are decisions for the corporation. I think in Australia it's a requirement that the top 300 have an audit committee, and all the members of that audit committee must be independent directors. As a general governance principle, that's what's recommended, that audit committee members should always be independent directors. You may want the chief financial officer to come in a lot and answer questions for you and tell you things. They may even attend most meetings, but they're not members of the committee. The remuneration committee is a trickier one. The remuneration committee determines the remuneration of the most senior executives, in particular the chief executive. Sometimes it also determines the remuneration for the board. Usually they will go and pay a consultant to come back and advise them on what that should be. And of course consultants aren't crazy. If they're making their job advising boards on what board remuneration should be, it's usually a pretty generous recommendation. Because what board of directors is going to appoint a consulting committee to advise on directors' remuneration, and how low can it to get it lower? Right? As a director, you're not seeking to lower your pay packet normally. So directors usually set, it's often reference to industry averages or comparable sized companies, but that still escalates remuneration because everybody wants everybody else's to be higher so that theirs can be higher. We see the same activity when it comes to executive remuneration. So Australian executives these days are paid far, far more than they were paid 20 years ago. It's actually almost true globally. And that's because everyone started referencing US executive remuneration as the benchmark. Say, oh, well, look, this is how much you get paid for this size company in the US, so you should get paid this much in the UK or in Australia or in Singapore or wherever you happen to be. And of course, the executives had a great incentive for doing this because it was increasing their personal pay packets. In the US, the problem is more complicated. In the US, executives sit on boards and often sit on multiple boards, and they sit on each other's boards. So when you look at a lot of the major US corporations, quite a number of the people sitting around that board table, the notionally independent executives, are actually chief executives of other corporations. When your pay packet is set by reference to the average of other corporations, you want the average corporation to have a higher pay packet. So as a chief executive, you have an incentive to make sure the chief executive of the company of which you're a director gets paid more, because eventually that means you can get paid more. This has been used as an explanation of why US executives are paid so much more, but chief executives are paid so much more. It's the chief executives are paid so much more, not all the other ones. And it's because they help set each other's pay packet. So that's been the history of it. Remuneration committees now are helping change this, but once things have reached thresholds, they don't come down very easily. So we continue to see continued escalation effects in executive remuneration through these arrangements. Just so you know, depends on which country you're in. The Australian context, the intended remuneration structures are subject to shareholder votes, the non-binding votes. If there are consecutive votes against the remuneration report, then there may be a spill of directors. That is, that all directors have to stand down and re-stand for election at the next annual general meeting, and shareholders can then vote against them. So that's the big threat. That's the extent of the threat. The directors' remuneration, though, has to actually be approved by the shareholders. So if the shareholders reject the executive remuneration report, then that doesn't necessarily do anything. The directors can just ignore it and still pay the executives what they want. But the director's remuneration has to be approved by the shareholders. And so that's presented each season or each time there's going to be a change. They present the proposal to the shareholders about how they're going to change board of directors' remuneration. And that's why we probably see directors' remuneration hasn't quite followed the same excess remuneration process that we've seen happen with executive remuneration. So directors of Australian corporations aren't badly remunerated, but it's not crazy level stuff. They don't get paid millions. You also might note that the directors get paid on different bases. Sometimes they're best paid lump sums for being directors, like a salary. Sometimes they're paid a base amount plus sitting fees. So you get more meetings the more you get paid. You'll also typically get paid more for committee work. So different committees will attract different additional payments. And the chair of the board, of course, always gets an additional payment as chair of the board because that's pretty near a full-time job. Or at least a major one. Most executive directors, at least in the Australian context, executive directors do not get paid extra. They don't get paid as directors. The executive directors are usually just paid as executives. And as part of their contract as executives, that they are given these board positions, and that's sort of all dealt with in the executive remuneration arrangements. That's a practice, it's not a law, that's just what happens. Okay, I just want to talk briefly about ethics in the public interest as it affects boards of directors. So we're going to talk about public interest more in week 5. We're going to talk ethics more when we talk about contemporary corporate governance concerns in week 6. All I want to do is just get across a particular point at the moment. Okay. So I want to say that the board and the executive have an ethical duty to act in the best interest of the corporation. That's the stewardship function. Now, you can also say that that applies then to acting in the interests of the shareholder, but that doesn't necessarily follow. I say they have a fiduciary duty as well, not just an ethical one, but that's always been recognised. That's understood that all directors, all corporate officers have a fiduciary duty to the corporation. But the board also has an ethical duty to make sure that the corporation acts in the best interests of its stakeholders and the public interest. Now, this is the one some people might debate more. No one is going to debate that point, because that point's almost just reflecting the legal position. But the second point people may well debate. Some people say they have a duty to act in the best, make sure the corporation's managed in the best interest of shareholders, but I'm suggesting it goes beyond that. So to say the corporation acts means that the decisions you make as a director and the decisions of others that you monitor have to be in the best interest of the corporation and the public interest. And this goes back to my earlier proposition about whether corporations are really capable of committing crimes. Because what the corporation does is a function of what the board allows it to do or causes it to do. And in discharging that duty, my proposition is you must ensure that it acts in the best interest of the public interest, but you certainly have an obligation to ensure that it acts within the boundaries of the law. You can't do things that you're not, you should not attempt to do things that you're not empowered to do. I would suggest to you that a corporation breaking the law and the directors not being responsible is exactly the same as trying to tell the traffic police that you weren't speeding, it was your car doing it. Right? If you're the driver, you're responsible for what that car does. And so, as the owner and driver of a corporation, of a motor car, you're responsible for that car being in a safe condition and being operated in a safe manner within the boundaries of the law. And so I'm suggesting it's the same for a corporation. As the driver of the corporation, and that's what the directors are, they control and direct the corporation, then they're responsible for it acting within the bounds of the law or satisfying its public obligations. You're going to do executive remuneration as a focused topic in week 7. All we're going to do today is just talk about a couple of general principles, because I want you to talk about them in next week's workshop as well, as to how it works. So I'm just giving you some guidance here about what you're going to do in preparing for next week's workshop. Okay. So I want you to talk about on what basis should executives be remunerated and on what basis should directors be remunerated. Now, the fact that I pose them as different questions should suggest to you that I think the answers are different. So what would be different between the way I'm going to reward executives compared to the way I'm going to reward directors? And so I want you to think in terms, particularly in terms of things like incentive alignments, bonus payments, those sorts of issues. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, so that the board should act for the best interest of the shareholders and then for the public interest, for the stakeholders.
Right.
As well. Go back to the next.
Yeah, we'll get there in a minute. We've just got a lot of steps to go through. Okay. Yeah. So you notice I didn't say shareholders. I said stakeholders. So I said ensure the corporation acts in the best interest of stakeholders in the public interest. I can find you people that will say shareholders instead. Okay. Okay. Some people will argue that. But now stakeholders include shareholders, but I haven't suggested which takes priority. Okay. But what do we mean by the best interest of the corporation? So try and think about the corporation here. Right? It's an abstract thing. It's just this legal form with assets and liabilities and business functions, business activities that it does. What's in its best interest? Why is more profit in its best interest? I'm not disputing it. I just want to know why is profit its best interest?
They want business to make money. I'm not sure, like maybe it's like ongoing basis, so they can run the business for longer. And
Okay, so now you want it to live.
yeah, live
Okay,
and
right. So yeah. So live long and prosper. Okay, so that's okay. So all corporations should be sort of consequences of Star Trek or something. Right? If that's your obligation, if you're going to help ensure the survival of the corporation, if you say the best interest of the corporation is its continued existence, its surviving, which requires it to prosper in some way. You don't survive if you're not competitive. Right? So you don't survive if you don't make profits. But you have to be able to meet your debts, compete, grow, find new business opportunities. Surviving requires a lot of stuff, right? So if that's in your best interest, what shareholder interest would be different to that? At what point would I be operating against the shareholder interest while I'm operating in the interest of the corporation? What could that be?
for example, they can reinvest into the business, use the money, the extra money, and the money they can also pay for the shareholders for dividends. So in this case, they have to make a decision. Like
Sure,
where they
okay.
invest.
So, but do you think some shareholders might be more interested in seeing the business grow?
Yeah, if I'm a long term.
Yeah, that's the problem, right? Not all shareholders have the same immediate interest. Now you say, if I'm interested in future wealth, well, and it's a question of, well, you say, well, surely then growing the company helps that. The question is, but the corporation might peak 20 years from now. You think I might be dead in 10. So we have different time horizons. So the things that don't align perfectly. Individual shareholders will not share interests the same, or they won't have the same preferences. So it's really difficult to equate the two exactly. But the question is, when they don't line up, which shareholder takes priority? Then we can't answer the question, right? There's no answer. Who says that shareholder who wants dividends now because of their own cash flow needs should have priority over this shareholder who's more interested in maximising their longer term wealth and therefore would rather see the money reinvested in the corporation in profitable activities that will grow their wealth even more in the future? I can't say that this one's more deserving than that one or has more rights than that one. So, but it's if I say I'm going to serve the corporate interest, then the answer is, well, I'll only be retaining the profits to reinvest them if that actually makes the corporation stronger and more prosperous. That will serve the interests of some shareholders. In some extent, it makes all shareholders better off because at the very least it should make the company's share price now higher because future expected profits will be discounted to current value. Right? So the theory is current share price is the present value of future cash flows, net future cash flows. Right? So making corporations better off in the future should make everyone better off now using a discounted model. That's a theory. Okay. But notice I haven't answered your question because there isn't one. Right? If shareholder interest in corporate, if some shareholder interest in corporate interests don't align, my proposition is the duty is to the corporation, not to some particular shareholders in it. My duty to shareholders would be the same to all shareholders collectively, and I shouldn't be preferencing some shareholders over others. And I've got no way of dealing with that other than by focusing on the corporation. That's what I'm proposing. Okay, see you next week.